What is tax policy? How is it made? And how can you take advantage of all of this as a tax professional? All of these questions are answered in this episode by our guest, Sam Mitha CBE, who headed HMRC's Central Tax Policy Group. Plus, he shares with us some stories that show how the making of tax policy can be secretive, a bit like an MI5 agent. You're listening to episode 86 of the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps tax professionals to progress, develop, and improve their careers.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode. This is one of those unique episodes where we get a real sneak peek into a secretive area of tax, in this case, tax policy. We're fortunate enough to have Sam Mitha, who spent his entire career in HMRC, in tax policy, in senior roles. The aim of this episode is to improve your understanding of tax policy and how understanding tax policy is beneficial for you and your career. And to do that, Sam shares with us what tax policy is, how guidance fits into the tax policy process, why it's beneficial for us as tax professionals to understand how policy is made, the legislation making process, the extent of the Chancellor's involvement in tax policy, and how we can get involved in tax policy for the benefit of our career. He also tells us a few stories that really bring tax policy to life, a few of which made working in tax policy sound a bit like being an MI5 agent. Rough timings for each section of this episode can be found in the details section of the episode within your podcast player of choice, or by heading on over to the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP86. The link to the show notes is the only link that you need to remember, as all of the links mentioned throughout this episode are included in there. The show notes are thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP86. Drafting and implementing legislation is a key part of tax policy, as legislation is what brings the policy to life. The legislation is drafted to implement the policy and make it a reality, and understanding this can aid you in interpreting legislation. I know firsthand that using and interpreting legislation can be challenging, even more so where there are ambiguities. I think this scares people from learning how to use it. And to me, that's just a huge shame and a mistake. And it's why I cover tax legislation in detail in the Tax Research Masterclass, so people can find, use, and interpret legislation at work. I want people to be confident in using legislation and to get the huge benefits that legislation brings. Details for the next masterclass can be found at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses, and the next one is scheduled for February 2024. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. If you don't mind then, Sam, just to start us off for this episode, could you just tell us a bit about you, your career, and your background in tax?
Jack, I am what's known colloquially as a revenue lifer. I joined the revenue straight from university. That's the old Inland Revenue. But I've also spent significant amounts of time in the Cabinet Office. And I initially trained, my academic training was as an economist. But when I joined the Inland Revenue, I became a fully trained tax inspector. And I was in charge of 2 tax offices, including one in the City 16, which is something I'm very proud of. And then I sort of more or less specialized in policy work because that's what I found interesting. So I totted up that I've had more than 30 years of experience of policy work. When I retired from the HMRC in 2014, I was the head of the HMRC's Central Tax Policy Group. I was responsible for coordinating all of HMRC's policy advice to the Chancellor and other Treasury ministers. It had a large team of people dealing with policy-related measures. But immediately prior to that, I'd been head of policy in HMRC on the structure of income tax and national insurance contributions and devolved income tax. And prior to that, I'd been involved in business taxation, where I'd been involved in the introduction of the large company R&D scheme and a variety of other measures. I was also responsible for leading policy on the introduction of self-assessment in the run-up to it coming live in 1997. Only one other thing to mention, which is that I have extensive experience of working with the Treasury and other government departments and with senior ministers. Now, that's been a characteristic of my entire career. But I've been dealing in policy matters working with the Treasury and other government departments and with ministers.
Mm-hmm. So someone like me, your career actually sounds really interesting, actually, because
Thank you.
you've almost dabbled in a lot of different things as well. So in terms of like different tax areas, you've worked on different ones of those, like R&D, you said, self-assessment. They're like completely different taxes, aren't they? So you've managed to have like a wide variety of experience there. You've also had this experience of dealing with Treasury and ministers as well, and they're obviously very, like, I suppose, seen as important people in society, high up in the hierarchy. So like, how did you find it? It sounds like you must have enjoyed it to do it for 30 years anyway, overall.
I felt very comfortable in what I was doing, and I retained contact with many of the people I had dealings with, not just my former colleagues in HMRC, but my former colleagues in the Cabinet Office, my colleagues in the Treasury, and with my former ministers. I still see some of the ministers I worked for, because, I've been very fortunate in working with immensely able people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've benefited hugely from the fact that they've been so generous and helpful.
Yeah.
And, so when I talk about I did this and that and the other, it's always I did this and the other with my colleagues. So that actually counts for the attachment I have for them. But I liked them when I was working with them, and I still like them.
Yeah. If you can boil it down to something real simple, then, like, what is tax policy really? Because we talk about it a lot, or we hear the word at least a lot, being tax advisors or working in the tax profession, but I think probably not many people really fully appreciate and understand what it is. So for someone who's worked in it for so long, like, how would you describe tax policy to everyone else? What is it?
I think tax policy has been described as the government's approach to the tax system, but that doesn't actually really capture it. Tax policy is really about analyzing, evaluating, and understanding the proposals that are made for changes to the tax system. And if ministers decide that the changes are significant enough and that they're happy with them, then transmuting whatever conclusions you've come to in that stage of designing whatever the measure is into draft legislation, whether it's primary legislation or secondary legislation. And in this connection, Jack, it's really important to emphasize that although HMRC sometimes has a rather staid image amongst other government departments, it is actually a very important policy department. Because unlike most other government departments, we always have a finance bill because income tax needs to be renewed.
Mm-hmm.
And as tax practitioners know, literally hundreds of pages of new law being published every year, which they need to be aware of. So it's not like some of government departments where there are very few changes in the law. They're very, very, not relatively significant. Here it is, the tax system is incredibly dynamic. And tax policy is effectively being in the pilot of a very dynamic system.
Yeah. So if I can, I suppose, summarize that in my own words and to make sure I'm following. So essentially it's everything related to creating new policy, figuring out what new policy needs to be made, and then actually making it. Is that kind of a way of describing it?
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I thought tax policy included before we started having this conversation, and maybe it is included, you can tell me if not, but when there's like a law that's being created and there's some legislation written around it, and then HMRC has like its view, its interpretation of how it applies those rules, etc. Is that classed as tax policy as well, or is that something different?
No, what you're touching on is guidance. Because in a sense, actually, once something has been turned into legislation or draft legislation, there is actually a point of view as to what it is all about, and it's all enshrined in whatever happens in Parliament while that legislation is being enacted, or in the material that's published alongside the draft legislation. Now, I'm rather old-fashioned about this because I think that HMRC's elaboration of what legislation is about doesn't actually amplify or restrict whatever's in the legislation itself. So, it actually reflects it. And the whole point of actually HMRC producing guidance is primarily for its own staff. There are a large number of people working in HMRC, and those who are involved in implementing the legislation need to know what it's all about, because they don't have the benefit of working on the policy side to know what it is we had in our minds when we were talking to ministers, Treasury officials, and to colleagues in the tax profession about what the legislation is about. And one of the things I was going to touch on was where guidance fits in the tax policy process. In a sense, actually, Jack, the preparation of guidance is something that's not done by the tax policy team. It's done by colleagues who are the technical experts. But as I will describe in a moment, the people who are the technical experts on the legislation in a particular area where tax policy is active are always actively involved in the tax policy process. So I'll give you an example. In most of my high-profile policy rules, and I think all of them have been very simple, I've always had responsibility both for the people who are responsible for policy and the technical experts. And my golden rule was always that I wanted the people who were the technical experts working with me and my policy team colleagues, because we were not the experts on the existing legislation. And, producing draft legislation and persuading ministers to take it through Parliament is not the be-all and end-all of everything, because the real be-all and end-all of everything is how it's implemented. And to implement it properly, we need to make sure that our colleagues understand what the legislation is all about. And, as you know, HMRC publishes its guidance now. It's not binding on people. The only thing that's binding on people is the law. So if people take a different view to HMRC guidance on something, they're perfectly entitled to appeal against whatever measure way in which HMRC interprets it.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that I've come across just in my short 8 years of working in tax where HMRC guidance doesn't cover a particular circumstance, say, but there's clearly a view being made internally that when situation X occurs, Y is the outcome in HMRC's view. Is that connected to the guidance piece and it's just not published, or is it something completely different there? Because I've seen it quite a few times actually. And I think once HMRC seems to have that firm view on something, even if there's a good chance it's wrong, you can't seem to shift their view from it.
I'm aware of this particular circumstance. And of course, the fact of the matter is that HMRC's got technical experts on all its legislation. And they are effectively then the department's national experts on the subject. So that if people who are actually dealing with these issues out in the field and dealing with tax practitioners have a particular issue and there's a point of difficulty, they always come to the HMRC technical experts. So they're actually looking at things from all across the country. And very often what's happening is that as a case is being pursued, the head office experts on the technical subjects are actually providing advice to the people that tax practitioners are corresponding with. And in doing that, they're drawing upon their knowledge of their involvement in the policy process in many cases. But more fundamentally, they're drawing upon what they've gathered from across the department from other colleagues dealing with the case. So that is almost certainly the origin of a point of view on particular type of issue that they may have actually seen. An individual tax practitioner, even if they're specializing on something, is unlikely to see as many cases as the head of his technical expert.
Mm-hmm.
The technical cases from the entire country.
Yeah.
And they're only getting the difficult ones. And so when they're advising another colleague who is actually dealing with it on an individual basis, they're drawing upon that expertise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, once it reaches a critical mass, what will happen is that then gets added to the guidance.
Okay. So once that one point's come up enough times, you think, right, it's time to put that in guidance now. Yeah. Got it. That makes sense.
But that doesn't actually make it law.
No, of course not. Of course not.
Law is the law. And as I said, I'm very firm on this, that anything I've ever been involved in, the guidance is to help to explain what provision is and how we would deal with it. But it cannot actually either expand or restrict.
Yeah.
If that is to happen, you need to change the legislation.
Yeah, I completely agree. So, from your perspective then, Sam, why do you think it is important for tax professionals to understand how policy is made? How is it helpful for them as a tax professional? Why should they know about it?
I would say this, having devoted my life to it, I think tax policy is very important to tax professionals because really it gives them an insight into how the measure that a tax professional is not going to read a piece of legislation for the fun of it. They read it because they've got a client who needs advice on a particular issue. And, an interest in tax policy actually gives them an insight into why the measure was designed in the way it was and the kind of considerations that went into producing it. And more fundamentally, what it does is actually gives them an insight into how it fits into the wider scheme of things, and also explains other changes might happen in the light of what they've understood about a particular piece.
Mhm.
And remember, the tax policy is an intensely political process. And it is dynamic, as I said, with the sense that, somebody who's actually specialized in particular legislation and they made a lot of investment in understanding legislation and case law, that's bound to be, in a sense, looking backwards. Tax policy is actually something that actually cater for a large range of situations, including some which have not occurred, but which are expected to occur, possibly for behavioral reasons. So, it really widens up one's understanding of tax provisions. And Jack, I was briefly, as I say, a fully trained tax inspector, and I was in charge of an office in the city and all sorts of techie things. I found it very frustrating that I didn't have an insight into all these things, which is why I was fortunate enough to be able to shift to doing policy work, because that's what I feel most comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, I think anybody who actually tries to do a job which is based entirely on the technical side of things is actually missing out on a big dimension to the measure.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hoping to bring out in what we're going to be talking about.
Mm-hmm. The one thing where I'm thinking, I suppose looking back into when a tax policy was created or why it was created, there's some cases in tax legislation where it's very black and white, right? And so is it in HMRC's guidance because it matches up with that. So those things are quite simple. But I started working in tax in 2015. And so obviously anything that was created before I started working in tax, unless I go and look as to the reason why that was brought in, I have no idea, right? And so if I'm working with an ambiguous piece of legislation or where there's different interpretations of it, without going backwards and looking at that information, it's very hard, I think, to understand it. It helps you to appreciate it quite a lot more. But for me now, because anything that's been brought out, at least in the employment taxes arena anyway, that's been brought out since I've worked in tax, I've kind of lived and breathed that coming in. And so, yes, I can see legislation and I can understand that, but I also have the context already in my mind as well. And to be fair, when I'm working with rules that have been brought in since I've worked in tax, it's much more intuitive and easy, I think, for me to understand it and apply it in practice.
That's a very good way of putting it, Jack. And actually, from what you're saying, it appears that you have a qualitatively better understanding of the measures that have been brought in during the time that you were in practice than things that were introduced before you were in practice.
Yeah. And it's not like I don't understand stuff that came out before me. Of course I do. I just feel like it's a stronger understanding because a lot of the cases as well in employment taxes, because it's a fairly small area compared to some other areas of tax. I tend to read all the consultations that come out. So I read the consultations. I also read the consultation outcomes. And sometimes there can be numerous consultations, can't there? From the start of thinking we need to bring in some policy here, all the way to the draft legislation and it being passed through Parliament if it's going through as an act to get royal assent, right? There's a lot of processes. And actually, whilst, from what I've seen anyway, it tends to, from the start to the last piece, like the last consultation outcome, if there's, let's say, a few of them, a lot of the measures tend to follow through or similar from the first part. It just becomes more refined in a way and more focused than what it was at the beginning.
Well, you put the case brilliantly, actually, Jack. You explained why tax policy is relevant. I'm one of these people who wants to understand why I'm being asked to do something. And you just explained that brilliantly.
Thank you. You can tell I'm a bit of a tax nerd. You said you've never met you said people don't just read tax legislation for the fun of it. You might have met the first person who has done that sometime.
Oh my God. Jack, I must say there was widespread incredulity when I got through all my inspector training first time round, because I have never had any particularly deep interest in the in the legislation or the case law. And I must say that although I've been directly responsible, see a large swathes of what's on the statute book, I can only remember a couple of measures. I can never remember statutory references or cases or whatever, because my interest is in the evolution and the creation of the measures. And once I've done that, I moved on to something else.
Yeah.
And the reason I can afford to take this attitude is that I've always been in a senior role.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also always had the extremely good fortune of working with very clever colleagues who already know their stuff backwards. It's not, I was going to see you mentioning the taxation of employment income. HMRC and the Inland Revenue prior to it, more so, was that you actually had people who had spent 10, 15 years whose entire scope of whose responsibilities was a few lines of legislation. And they were enormously important because, as you know, personal income tax personal taxation is the biggest source of government revenues. And, the application of the law in those few crucial lines had a bearing on massive amounts of tax liability. And so, it was important that the people who were advising on those bits of the law actually understood the legislation inside out and all the case law related to it. And, that dedicated their lives to it.
Mm-hmm.
And now, as I say, that's something I can't do myself.
Yeah.
But I'm very fortunate that, I've been able to draw upon that kind of expertise in doing tax policy.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the things I actually like so much about working in tax, because you've worked in tax your whole career.
Yeah.
But you've worked in a very different area to what a lot of other people have, and they would have worked into different areas to other people. So you've kind of said really that legislation and case law didn't really interest you. That wasn't your thing, but you still found something in tax that was, and you made a full career out of it, and a good career as well.
Well, I am really very interested in economics and politics. And, I really appreciate the abilities and the qualities of the people who are actually the technical experts. So in a sense, I've got an ideal job because, everything I'm doing and was doing when I was working was at the cutting edge of whatever was happening on these areas. And, there's no way of understanding tax policy without realizing that tax is drenched in politics.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about it, the state of which the government is the current embodiment, is actually using its power to make people give up a very substantial proportion of something people worked very hard to earn. And the state is saying, we're going to take away a proportion of your income to fund the public services and public goods. Public goods are goods that you can't actually make people pay for. So, if you build a bridge or, you can make people pay for a bridge, but defense or healthcare or whatever, they're a common good. And they can only pay for through public expenditure. And, it is really very important to understand these things.
So in terms of we've touched upon this a little bit already, about having the consultation process, etc. But almost what have we not talked about? So what have I missed? Because I'm sure there's a lot more to tax policy than what I've made it sound like. I've probably massively oversimplified it, or I don't know really what goes on behind the scenes. Whereas obviously you've seen that happen many times over the course of your career. So consultation's one thing, but what other areas are?
Well, I was going to say again, there is a division of labor in these things. So tax policy. If I'm sitting in the office, what's going to end up as draft legislation is going to only be a proportion of what I'm dealing with. I will be dealing with headlines that have appeared in the newspapers. I'll be dealing with parliamentary questions. I'll be dealing with problems that have arisen in the application of the law because, all of a sudden, some piece of legislation that was devised years ago has suddenly sprung a leak. Dealing with reassuring ministers that we've got something covered, there are all sorts of things happening. I remember when I was dealing with a head of policy on income tax and national insurance and divorce legislation, coming into the office and finding that all the orchestras in Britain had suddenly decided they were going to be bankrupted by HMRC's application of the NICS legislation. We didn't quite understand why this had come about. They'd actually gone and briefed all their friends in the media. And the next thing you knew, we were being bombarded by phone calls from people from the newspapers saying, what's going on? It was reported on the news. Ministers were saying, what's going on? Why are you bankrupting the orchestras? And as I say, this is an old piece of legislation. It wasn't anything new. So tax as a way of affecting people's lives. And, when people get agitated about it, it turns into waves of protest, initially intermediated by the media, and which transmute themselves to ministers, questions in the House, and having to respond to them.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody, we've had the Chancellor who was very fond of dining with his very wealthy constituents, and every Monday or Tuesday we would get questions from his private office because he would have had his ear bent by the people he was dining with about this or that or the other. And so, we needed to be able to explain to him that, if things weren't quite as mad as the dining companion had made them out to be, or that we'd look into it.
Yeah.
So, being involved in tax policy is a very lively, interesting job.
Yeah.
And it's one that requires a very deep understanding of what's going on in terms of politics.
Yeah. I actually find it quite funny how, I know, I'm sure you summarised or paraphrased or whatever, but when you get asked the question by a minister, why are you bankrupting? Why is HMRC bankrupting orchestras? It's just like, that clearly wouldn't be what's happening, would it? It'd be that some tax thing in the background is bringing a charge about that's making them have to pay a lot of money or something, right? I just find it funny how this is what happens to the media anyway. You must have experienced it a lot over your career, but when things get into the media about tax, they're very overly simplified, usually to the extent that they're wrong. And then, but people get behind it, right? They'll start rallying the troops with this absurd understanding of something that's completely wrong. But as soon as it's out there, right? And then I'm presuming by the sounds of it, you or your team would have had to deal with that.
Jack, that's precisely the point. Most people don't understand tax because it's complicated. I've admitted I don't actually understand the technical bits of things, but I don't need to because I'm an expert in tax policy. And, what happens is now people who are musicians, people who are running orchestras, not experts in tax. So they hear something, they talk to each other, and they realize that the circumstances are similar, and they jump to the conclusion that they themselves will be qualified. Now, in that particular instance, the way the matter was resolved was by speaking to their paymasters with the Arts Council. Most orchestras are actually funded by the Arts Council or some kind of public body that provides funding there, and suggesting that what they did was hire a firm of lawyers or accountants to represent them, because it wasn't my job to tell them that they were worrying about nothing, because they wouldn't necessarily believe. But, in discussion with the people they appointed, we were able to allay their concerns. And because they'd appointed themselves, or their paymasters appointed them, they had a high degree of credibility in listening to us, that we hadn't woken up in the morning and decided to destroy the orchestras. But these are just kind of things that come up. I'd always make sure that we monitored Prime Minister's questions.
Yeah,
because somebody would get up and say, "My constituent has just been told this, that, and the other."
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you do when is always provide briefing if something's going on. It's our responsibility as a policymaker to provide briefing to ministers in advance of them being hit by questions.
Yeah.
So, we provide briefing with ministerial questions, prime ministerial questions if it's a big enough issue, so that they're ready and prepared if somebody raises it. It isn't new legislation, but, people want reassurance, and they want to know that whatever's happening is something that we've got to grip on. It's not just an arbitrary process.
If you want to read the benefits of being able to use tax legislation, and the Tax Research Masterclass could be exactly what you need. Head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses for full details. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses. A link is also included in the show notes for this episode and within the details section of this episode within your podcast player of choice.
Yeah. In terms of, this is an area that I think I'm personally interested in more, is like the legislation drafting process, because I've thought about it before when I've read like draft legislation.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure I'm not alone in doing this, and it's probably slightly arrogant, but I think I could have done a better job than this. Like it's got loads of holes in it. It doesn't seem to be thought out like properly, which I'm sure it has, but sometimes obviously with a fresh pair of eyes outside of HMRC, you can feel like that. Like, who is it that actually drafts it? Is it people within HMRC? Is it?
Yeah. No, I was going to check. That's a very, very, very good question. And remember, this is actually when you're talking about changes to tax policy, this is really the bottom end of the process. But I'm very happy to talk about it now. Once a new tax proposal has come forward, let's say ministers say they want to change the law about something. Treasury and HMRC will have a discussion about it and come up with options, and then go back to ministers and say, this is what it's all about. These are the options. Which one do you prefer? And once ministers have made the high level decisions, and this is really important, ministers make all the important policy decisions. But they would never be able to do anything else if we kept on going to them and saying, what about this and what about that? So they're actually making high level decisions. But once that's happened, the policy teams work out the detail, the structure of the legislation. And this is then encapsulated in what's known as instructions to council. There are two kinds of legislation, as you know, Jack. There's primary legislation, which is like Parliament, and there's secondary legislation, which is made on existing regulation-making powers. Primary legislation, what's contained in a finance sector or other act of Parliament, is actually drafted by a very specialized department or the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. Secondary legislation is made on the authority of a prior piece of legislation in the Finance Act or another act of Parliament, which allows governments to make regulations within very tightly circumscribed circumstances. So secondary legislation would never impose a tax charge. Anything that imposes a tax charge or gives a tax relief has to be in primary legislation, which is included in the Finance Act. And that legislation is drafted by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, which is a group of incredibly hardworking and able lawyers who specialize in converting the instructions they receive from government departments into legislation. As far as tax legislation is concerned, here are some very interesting little known facts about it. In most government departments, the instructions to parliamentary counsel are actually drafted by the department's lawyers. But when it comes to tax legislation, the instructions to Office of Parliamentary Counsel are actually drafted by officials. So I had a large team of people, and typically it would be the person who was helping with any particular policy, who would be the person who would be writing the instructions to counsel. And these instructions to counsel would be written in conjunction with the technical colleagues. Because you need to tell parliamentary counsel that, you want to change the law in some respect. And you need to explain the context in terms of, we've already got the counsel are lawyers, but they're not specialists in tax. They are by the time they finish drafting a few finance bills, obviously. But, you need to explain this is an aspect of legislation which has got this or that history, to give them context and tell them what it is you're trying to do. What you must never do, and this is something that really upsets even the most genial of parliament counsel, is tell them how to write the law. Now, the way tax law is written has actually undergone quite a significant change, because following the Inland Revenue's tax law rewrite, on which several members of the Office of Parliamentary Counsel were members, you move to a different style of writing tax legislation. Now, there's a real world of difference between really old legislation and legislation written after this period. And as tax legislation got consolidated, when tax legislation was consolidated, bring together different provisions from different finance acts on particular subjects in one area, the legislation that came out was significantly longer because it actually spelled things out to make it more intuitively easy to follow what was going on. Because if you look at really old legislation, you can look at it 100 times and it's very difficult to understand what it is that they're doing. Everything was written in very concentrated. But, the Office of Parliamentary Counsel works very hard to try and make sure that legislation is written in a form that's comprehensible and intuitive. You still don't need lawyers to understand it very often. I know that people like yourself and my colleagues who are technical experts are as good as lawyers in understanding it. And, of course, what has happened in the last 10, 20 years is, of course, all draft legislation is now exposed. So, you see it, you get a chance to see it because it's published in draft. Let me give you an example of what sea change this is. One of the most formative experiences I went through, Jack, was when I was appointed a member of a very small team of colleagues dealing with something called the offshore and overseas funds legislation. When I arrived, all we knew about it was that the then Chancellor Nigel Lawson had said that he was going to stop the tax avoidance by these kind of entities. And my first job in that team was actually to find out for the benefit of the team exactly what these offshore funds were. We couldn't go out and ask people about this because those are the days when there was very limited, there was no consultation. And, we given that we were dealing with what was essentially anti-avoidance legislation, we couldn't go and talk to people because we didn't want to give anybody commercial advantage about what we were doing. That legislation, which we probably started working on in August or September of 1983, was converted into 40 pages of draft legislation by the following year. Now, the only people who'd seen this draft legislation, just imagine 40 pages of very complex legislation. And the only people who'd seen this draft legislation were the 3 people on the team, and a couple of other people in the department. So altogether, a total of 5 people had seen this legislation apart from the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. And the first time the world saw this legislation was when it was included in the finance. If you're a sad case, actually, Jack, and I'm sure you're not, read the parliamentary proceedings about the Finance Act 1984 and the debates about the offshore and overseas funds legislation. The minister who was taking the legislation through saying that he regarded the officials who were briefing him, namely us, with veneration because, he made it plain that he didn't understand what the legislation was all about, but that he had enormous faith in what we were telling him. But just imagine you wake up one morning, you find out that you've got 40 pages of legislation affecting your clients, which would feel. Yeah, the world is completely different now because you wouldn't find it in anti-avoidance context, but in general context. Excuse me, there would have been a consultation about the measure. You've seen the legislation a year before. And this legislation was written on the old style of writing legislation, so it's very concentrated. And so you can imagine how detailed it was when you thought that this had to be translated into something. But this is the way that the approach to drafting legislation has changed over time. First of all, the new style of writing the legislation following the tax law rewrite project. Secondly, the changes in the consultation, the approach to consultation. I'm not kidding you, Jack. Nobody outside the department had an inkling about what this legislation contained. The first time they saw it is the publication of the file.
Yeah, that's insane.
Contrast that in the 84 Act also included legislation on controlled foreign companies. And that legislation on controlled foreign companies had actually been published a year before. So people had seen both pieces of legislation originated with the removal of exchange controls. So controlled foreign company legislation was needed to prevent corporates from transferring money outside the UK and using it, then avoiding tax that way. And the
Yeah.
offshore funds legislation was individuals doing the same thing, with even through the use of roll-up funds. You transfer your capital abroad, put it in a roll-up fund, and then the money would accumulate abroad. And as long as it didn't arise in the form of dividends, there was no liability until you actually cashed in the fund.
Yeah. When it comes to anti-avoidance legislation, actually, I can see how that's more difficult. It must be one of HMRC's biggest challenges, actually, dealing with that. 'Cause it's such a sensitive topic as well, isn't it?
It is. And I was going to say, it isn't something that happened 40 years ago, because when I led the introduction of the bank payroll tax in 2009, in the wake of the financial crisis, we ministers said that only a handful of officials could be involved in this. So if I said I needed somebody else to work on it, I had to ask for permission to add somebody to the list. We were in an open plan office by that time, and I had to tell my immediate team that they couldn't have any of their colleagues in other teams coming to visit because of the risk of this. And that legislation was published in exactly the same way, except it was much shorter, it wasn't 40 pages. But the bank payroll tax legislation was done in great secrecy by myself and my team, handful of people, less than a handful of people.
Yeah.
And, I said I never remembered legislation, or whatever it is. I can remember vividly that I got permission from the minister to publish the legislation the next day on the early hours of the morning, the 9th of December. And on the 10th of December, the whole world seemed to collapse because, when people saw this legislation, the banks who were affected, this legislation that affected only 200 banks, the world seemed to have come to an end, because they were so upset about it.
Yeah.
But, this is the way legislation is sometimes built. I'm personally in the office till 2:00 in the morning for a fortnight, not a fortnight, for all of that 9-week period. And on the 9th of December, my colleagues and I left the office at 4:00 in the morning. Because just finishing all the stuff to get it ready to publish the next day. And here's the remarkable thing, actually, Jack. This legislation came into effect on the 9th of December. Was a legislation that only lasted until the 5th of April the following year.
Oh, really?
Just think about it. It's 4 months. It raised over 2,000 million pounds. 2 billion pounds. And wait for this. The legislation was included in the finance bill for 2010. And it wasn't enacted until after the period for which the tax was in existence had expired. Obviously, people didn't have to pay the tax until the finance bill had received royal assent. But this very controversial measure was just noted through because, of course, 2010 is when you had an election. And the money had to be paid in August. And I remember sitting in my office with one of those thermometer-style charts. And I was getting phone calls from my colleagues in the large business office saying, X or Y bank has paid 200 million pounds, 400 million pounds, as coloring the thermometer type chart. The reason for doing that was not decoration, because I was getting calls from the minister's office saying, what's happened to the tax? How is it going? I was sort of giving them hourly dates of how much money we're collecting. Because, all that was specified in the legislation as to how and when the money is paid and to whom. And, but you could do these things because there were only 200 potential taxpayers. The number of people who were caught was much smaller.
Yeah.
But, that's tremendously exciting. The flip side of the coin was that having worked so hard for so long, and in the immediate period after that, I became, shall we say, a bit tired. I became quite unwell. I came down with pneumonia from working so hard for such a concentrated period of time under such strain. But, this is tremendously important because following the financial crisis, feelings were running very high at the banks. And the bank payroll tax was a tax on banks, on the bonuses they paid to the people whose actions had been regarded as being contributory to the financial crisis. Because, people were being paid huge bonuses And, that had encouraged people who were dealers and traders in banks to take greater risks than they might have done if they had actually had to deal with the consequences of it.
Yeah. It's almost like a punishment then, that one.
Well, it wasn't punishment, because remember, the banks were all near collapse in the financial crisis, and the government had to bail all of them out.
Yeah.
And the banks themselves were not going to pay any tax themselves, but they were going to be making payments to the senior staff and running into millions of pounds, on which, all they would have done is they would have borne on the employer's necks of that liability, and they would have deducted the income tax from the payments to these people. But, this was a tax which said, all right, we're going to charge the pay 50%, the payment on that, and they won't be able to deduct it. Bank can deduct payments to its staff as a case one deduction.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here was a situation that, where we say this is a charge on the banks, and the banks themselves would have to pay 50% of the amount of the dividend, not the dividend, but the bonus, the tax liability, and they won't be allowed a deduction.
Yeah.
So, tremendously exciting. I hope I've conveyed something about how exciting tax policy can be. This is tax done in a very short period of time in great secrecy.
Yeah, it's almost like working a bit like an MI6 or type of thing, isn't it, in a way?
We couldn't ask anybody anything about the bonus arrangements in the banks. We subsequently discovered after the event that the banks never told anybody how they actually decided bonus payments. So we thought that after the event, if we spoke to people who were the tax advisors and the lawyers of these banks, we might get an insight over how they did it. But, after the legislation had been done, and they say they didn't have a clue. Because the banks kept it to themselves. You know about bank bonuses, Jack. We all know about that. And so, producing legislation in a situation where you don't have all the information is a very, very nerve-wracking affair. That, you produce a piece of legislation, and then when it's unveiled, what happens if people say, well, that's easy, we'll just walk around it, or we'll go under it, or we'll go over it. And the image that came into my mind on the day the draft legislation was published, and it's a pretty gory image, was an image of a fish being caught by a hook. What happened the next fortnight after that was, tremendous pressure from all these people, because they'd actually, it wasn't lengthy legislation. They weren't looking at 40 pages of legislation, but they looked at it very critically. All the top lawyers in the country and abroad, looking at it to see how they could get around it. And, it was a sense of tremendous pride in my colleagues and the Office of Parliamentary Counsel that we came up with legislation that was watertight.
Yeah.
And in the end, they paid up the money.
It's almost impossible, isn't it, to ensure 100% that something's watertight?
Yeah. Just, I would say there was a feeling, I think, on the part of the banks that there was a belated recognition they weren't prepared. And if any of them had actually created a fuss about the legislation, with public feeling running high about the banks, it would not have been a pretty picture.
No. This is where I suppose tax policy, politics, and media all kind of crosses over in this case about the bank payroll stuff that you've talked about.
Well, it's happened before as well, because look at what happened with it wasn't done, I hasten to add, with some pride and relief, that the tax I'm about to mention to you wasn't done by my department. It was the poll tax, the community charge. I never thought I'd leave the day to see that there was rioting outside my office. I was based, spent most of my career working in Parliament Street. But, there was rioting in the streets outside because of the community charge in 1990. The poll tax, as they called it, which resulted in the fall of, the most formidable Prime Minister Britain's had in the post-war period. This is that. And, the rioting was caused by the imposition of a tax charge that some people thought was very unfair. So tax can have very profound consequences. And it's really important to understand the political process, if what is effectively the confiscation of a large proportion of people's income, is a very sensitive issue, which is why Parliament is very jealous. Parliament has never delegated the job of taxing people. It takes the decision on rates of income tax itself. And income tax, as you know, is an annual tax and reimposed every year. For this reason, Parliament is very jealous of its right to impose tax, and and the fact that they're democratically elected confers legitimacy to the process. We must never lose sight of it.
Yeah. When it comes to like the budget, for example, that happens every year, some years more than once.
Yeah.
I've lost track now because of how often it seems to have changed in the 8 years that I've worked in tax. But obviously the Chancellor will stand up and give a speech which covers loads and loads of tax things, right? And as soon as that speech happens, or very shortly before or very shortly after, all the documentation and stuff is released. To what extent does the Chancellor actually get involved in the policy and stuff? Do they literally just get fed the information? Do they actually decide what might get put through, what might not, etc.?
I was going to say, Jack, that's a very good question. I mentioned that I had been the head of the Central Tax Policy. The Central Tax Policy Group in Inland Revenue, in HMRC, was the bit of the department that actually coordinated all the material coordinate all the tax advice that went to ministers. And tax advice at that time when a budget is imminent is very heavily coordinated by the central coordination team in the Treasury, which is very small, and the central coordination team in HMRC, which I headed up. And what happens is that all the measures that people are invited to provide measures for inclusion in the budget. The Chancellor writes to his colleagues, ministerial colleagues, and says, happy to receive budget representations. All the large representative bodies send in the wish lists. And, when any of these are actually regarded as things that ministers are likely to be interested in, they're all carefully logged. And they get entered into a process under which, there's a timetable for what needs to happen in terms of putting advice up to ministers. The advice is initially put up to the junior ministers in the Treasury. The measures that take absolute priority, obviously, measures which the Chancellor himself has said he wants to take forward. And in the immediate aftermath of an election, it's taken as read, and it's made clear to us by the Chancellor and ministers that they want to implement tax measures which were included in the election manifesto. So this is the famous electoral cycle that, taxes tend to go down before an election, and immediately afterwards they tend to go up, public spending will be cut. But, very often ministers will say in a party manifesto they're going to change this or that aspect of the tax system. So those always take priority because newly elected ministers want to make sure they demonstrate to the public that they promise. Right. Alongside that are a range of many other issues. Somebody sitting in a dingy room somewhere in 100 Parliament Street deals with an obscure piece of legislation. They have decided that it's not working as well as it should, and so that might have been registered as something that might be recorded. But these measures are very carefully logged, and they're also costed. And this is the origin of what's the famous budget scorecard. But at that stage, it's nothing, because you don't really have the information. And there's a timetable so my team and the Treasury Central team would send out a message to the policy community. My team would send a message to the policy community in HMRC. The Treasury one would send it to theirs. And all of this would be very coordinated because the two teams work very closely together and say, if you got a budget measure, which has been given to you by ministers or which you think ought to go forward, this is the deadline for you writing to junior ministers. And that's when people would start preparing what's known as submissions. So submissions are actually effectively communications between civil servants in the Treasury and HMRC to ministers. And policy work in HMRC is undertaken under what's known as the policy partnership between the Treasury and HMRC, which was established in the wake of the merger of Inland Revenue and Customs, which resulted in a division of responsibility between the Treasury and HMRC. Under this division, the Treasury was given responsibility by the then Chancellor, Gordon Brown, for strategic policy making. So Treasury deals with all the big picture issues. HMRC was given responsibility for policy maintenance and delivery, which is all the other issues. So if minister wants to reshape income tax or something, that'd be a strategic issue. But if he wanted to, say, tinker with bits of the system, then that would be policy maintenance. Most policy changes are actually incremental, making small changes to something which is enormous. But time to time, you'll have events such as the bank payroll tax, which is brand new. It was small beer in the context of the amount of revenue raised by income tax or NICS or VAT. So all these measures are carefully logged, and you have a timetable for sending advice to ministers where you'd actually set out the issue is, what implications it has, how it would be implemented, how it fits in with other measures, how much money it might raise, how much it would cost HMRC to implement the measure. And, suggesting to ministers that some action be taken and setting up the key options. Now, this has then culminated in the junior minister then sending a note to the Chancellor saying, I received advice from HMRC and the Treasury saying we should do X, Y, and Z. And I think this is what we ought to do. So the ultimate decision whether or not something is included in the budget is made by the Chancellor himself. And as I said, he would be obviously very keen to see that anything that was in the manifesto was included and any other measures that he had said he wanted done were there.
Yeah.
And the advice that goes up to ministers, whether it's junior ministers or the Chancellor, is always agreed between the people leading on the policy in the Treasury and HMRC. So, if it's an issue to do with personal tax, and this is one of the issues you asked me to focus on, anything to do with taxation is divided up between so-called subject areas. So that, there'll be a personal tax team in the Treasury and one in HMRC. The one in the revenue in HMRC will always be much bigger because it's got all the delivery and the technical experts and whatever. The Treasury team will be much smaller, but the people in charge of these things will always be in very close touch about measures. And any kind of measure that's going up to ministers would be jointly agreed between the policy leads. If the Treasury was putting up a submission to ministers, the corresponding revenue official would be seeing it in draft and vice versa. And you'd show them what you were putting up. Total transparency. That you couldn't put up something to ministers which sort of cut out the revenue or vice versa. The other thing that would happen is the central team, which I headed up in my last 3 years in the revenue in HMRC, would be watching to make sure that the left hand knew what the right hand was doing. I've seen there was a standing rule on policy work that all policy submissions had to be copied to me. And so and to particular part of my team, we could actually see that, closely related subjects, what the result didn't result in separate advice going up to ministers. Because, there wasn't, my team was established partly as a consequence of minister phoning up a permanent secretary and saying, I'm holding in my left hand, a note from X and Y in this part of your department, and I'm holding up in my right hand another submission from somebody else in your department. They both seem to be about the same subject, and they're not talking to each other. It's to minimize duplication to make sure there's properly coordinated submission. And as I said, all the advice that goes up to ministers reflects the combined view of both departments. So that's the meaning of the policy partnership. And once junior ministers have received their submissions, they write to this Chancellor. Chancellor makes his choice. And then these are the issues that are likely to be included in them. And then you're on to another timetable, which says, you need to get this ready. Consultation. What are you going to tell people about this measure? At what stage? When are you going to draft the legislation? So you need to make sure that you settled all the prior issues first. Because you can't go to Parliamentary Council saying, oh, we're still talking of this or that or the other. It needs to be, we've decided, ministers have decided this is what's going to happen. So, and this is how we want what we want by way of legislation to implement it. Now, remember, all this material is being circulated to the top of the department in both departments. It's being circulated to everybody who's got a related interest in the Treasury and HMRC. It's automatically being circulated to the head of the solicitor's office in HMRC, the head of the knowledge analysis and intelligence directorate, which is all the economics, statistics, operations, and to the operational people. Very often with very sensitive measures, the circulation list will be very restricted.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I was talking about the bank payroll tax, the circulation lists were only about a handful of people. Ministers had said that they wanted to restrict circulation of whatever we were working on to the barest minimum. And we could do that because there were only 200 banks that would be affected.
Yeah.
But if you're going to deal with something that's going to affect literally millions of people, then, HMRC operational people also need to be in the picture. And that brings to the fore something else, actually, which is a very material piece of information that goes to ministers, which is that there are two kinds of changes that you can make to the tax system. One is so-called parameter changes, where you're changing the level of the tax rate, personal allowance, or something like that. And there's structural changes, where you're saying you want to introduce a brand new relief or something. Parameter changes are easy to do because the operational people can deal with that quite easily. But if it's anything structural, they have to make IT changes, which can take up to 15, 18 months. But the other thing is, at any point in time, there's so many different measures being undertaken that they need to figure out some way of finding space to deliver the measures. One of my responsibilities in my last role was that every 6 months, I had to report to ministers on operational capacity. I'm not an operational man, but what I am is somebody who has a handle on what's been announced, what's likely to be announced, and over what time frame. So we can then speak to the operational people and say, how long will you be able to want this on hand? And it's in very high level terms. Because, the worst thing in the world is minister says, I want to do something. Then you have to pull cold water over it and say, we can't do it for another 2 years. These are very important issues in a very large department. HMRC is a gigantic department with huge systems. And it's dealing with, potentially 40, 50 million people.
Yeah.
40 million live taxpayers. So, these are very complex issues. And, it's all very well having arcane discussions about policy and politics and economics. It really boils down to actually implementing the changes. If you're changing rates, it can be done quite easily. Making structural changes, it's a far more complicated issue.
Yeah. Just for like a recent example, then you said about Treasury being responsible for the strategic policy making and HMRC essentially everything else. Like furlough, for example, then when furlough came in, because I think that to me as an outsider seemed to be instigated by Rishi Sunak at the time, who was Chancellor then, and who would have then ended up dealing with that then, because that feels like big strategic policy making to me, but it felt like HMRC dealt with a lot of that. So I thought HMRC did the guidance, for example.
Yeah. On the furlough scheme, the first thing to be said is, of course, it's not a tax measure.
Of course.
It
Yes.
uses the elements of the tax system. And the money that was being paid to people on furlough was coming from the employers, then being reimbursed by HMRC to the employers. My understanding of what happened at the furlough, and I'd retired by that time, was that the Chancellor met with officials from the Treasury and HMRC and said that he wanted to make a payment to people who were affected by the law. and the two departments in discussion with each other. And remember, the expertise on something like this has been primarily with HMRC, because Treasury's expertise is on strategic analysis and strategic delivery rather than the nitty-gritty of how the system works. So HMRC was very influential because they were mindful of the fact that they were going to have to deliver. And so, the meetings, very close meetings, I obviously know many of the principals between the Treasury, with the then Chancellor and Treasury and revenue officials, where revenue officials were instrumental in making a major contribution to the design what was decided. Remember, this hadn't happened in Britain before. We had the example of what was going on in other countries, because such provisions were already on their statute, so we could draw upon them to try and learn what we could be doing. And then it was a question of how to implement the changes. Now, you will know about the furlough scheme, that they were implemented by Treasury direction. The Treasury has the power to direct HMRC to do things. So, you didn't need an act of parliament to introduce the furlough scheme. You go back to the furlough scheme. I've got this covered in 2020. I wrote an article called on COVID-19 as it was happening. And that article, which is published in the American National Texture, it describes how the furlough scheme was implemented. And, HMRC then had the difficult job of saying, how can we implement what the Chancellor wants? You obviously can't tinker with the existing pay-as-you-earn system, which is on a computer program, NERS2. But, you had to set up something alongside so that the pay-as-you-earn system continued working as it was, but then you set up a program alongside it to make sure that you could reimburse the employers. And all the kind of measures that HMRC has to take when dealing with public money, really important, because you don't want to create any scope for fraud or evasion. But, this is very challenging. And it reflects tremendously to the credit of HMRC and the Treasury that they were able to do it in such a short span of time. If you want to read about it, Jack, this article, as I say, which is published in the National Texture, as part of a symposium they did on response to COVID-19, which contains a lot of the detail.
Yeah, I can.
They were based on what we knew at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I suppose just maybe the last point then. So obviously there's all this stuff about tax policy, and I suppose for many tax professionals, it sits there in the background. It happens. They need to deal with it. They need to understand what's changing, etc. But I suppose many tax professionals can get a little bit more involved in that, right? So, for example, I'm a member of the CIOT's Employment Taxes Committee, and I know that committee feeds into, say, consultations, for example, part of discussions with HMRC where they're thinking about making policies, I'm pretty sure, as well. So how can tax people who want to get involved and that get involved in tax policy if it's not their full-time job like it was for you?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that, this is something I'm often asked, because people hear me banging on about tax policy and say, oh my God, how can we get involved? And you've actually put your finger on the most important advice I give to people, which is make sure you join your professional body, whether it's the Institute of Chartered Accountants or the Chartered Institute of Taxation, and volunteer to serve on its specialist committees, as you have done. Because these committees are very important. Consultation is primarily for the benefit of HMRC and the Treasury, because, it gives them access to very able and highly qualified and well-informed policy professionals. Because, tax policy is made in very small teams in a very short period of time. So it's what you come up with is pretty rough and ready. When you go out to consultation, that's when people like yourself and your colleagues can actually look at what we've come up with and say, have you thought this right? Have you thought about this? These two don't link up. So it's really important that people recognize the contribution the representative bodies, especially professional representative bodies, make to the quality of tax legislation. So my first piece of advice to anybody interested in doing is join your professional body and volunteer to serve on the specialist committee. The next one is make sure you do what you were doing. Again, just, when consultations come out on a subject area close to your interest, make sure you read them because that'll give you an insight on what's happening. And either join in responding to the consultation through your professional body or yourself. There's nothing to stop you responding as an individual to consultations. And check, this is related to something you had in your note. I was really alarmed to hear that people feel that, their consultations are not valued. Consultations are dramatic. When I was doing the introduction of the large company R&D tax credit, the original proposal was that it should be introduced on a so-called incremental basis. When I ran a consultation, message I got from all the companies and the tech professionals that came into contact with that it would not achieve its purpose because people would not be able to understand the signal that the Treasury was giving in providing the relief. And so because I'd gone and listened to so many people, and spoken to so many tax advisors and companies, I was able to go back to ministers, persuade them. This is really significant change. They'd actually published very clear directions saying it was going to be on an incremental basis. But because of what I got through the consultation, I was able to persuade them to change to a so-called volume system. The difference between the two is this. In an incremental system, you're only rewarding people for what happens in the current year or the period which the relief is applied. In a volume system, you're just saying, we're going to reward all the activity you're doing. So it makes quite a difference. So, this was direct impact of the consultations. I mentioned self-assessment. I was actually the chairman of the self-assessment consultative committee, which included luminaries such as Robert Hess, John Whiting, Nigel Easterby, all the big names in the tax profession. And practically anything that happened on self-assessment went through this committee. And again, the kind of representations we got through the self-assessment consultative committee had a profound impact on design of the self-assessment return, on the way the compliance arrangements were operated, issues such as discovery, and the submission of information. But then Inland Revenue was very keen to make it a success. So, this self-assessment consultancy, but it was very powerful. And, people gave up a huge amount of their time to do something which was in the common interest. So consultations are very important. When revenue holds a consultation, all the responses that come in are collated, they're evaluated, they're summarized and reported to ministers. Now, one thing about consultations that people often forget is that if ministers have already taken a decision, they're going to do so. It doesn't make a lot of sense to go along and say you don't agree with what they're going to do, because that's not a response to a consultation, which is why consultations are constrained in terms of what they're asking people. And really, it's the professional institutes make a remarkable contribution to improving the quality of tax legislation and tax policy because of the voluntary activities of, and you see this, I see the consultation responses coming at 4:00 in the morning because people are doing it at the end of a long day on top of their day job, as you do.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I had heard that any consultation being run by my team or, in the period when I was responsible all of that people had been rude to people who had sent in consultations, it would not have been a pretty good.
If people do want to find out a bit more about you anyway, Sam, or get in touch, where are the best places for them to go?
I think the first thing I would say to people is that I've written a lot about tax policy, and a good starting point, because, is probably to look at taxjournal.com, because, the Tax Journal has published a lot of my articles. If they want to get in touch with me, I can be reached through LinkedIn. I can be reached through my email address, which is Sam, S-A-M, Mitha, M-I-T-H-A, 3, that's a numeral, at gmail.com. Or just be at me when you see me at one of the professional gatherings where, I'm out and about a lot and I meet a lot of people, but don't hesitate to get in touch with me. And I think probably the easiest way of getting in touch with me for many people would be just through LinkedIn. And, if they want to email me, I'd be very happy to hear from them as well.
So hopefully, like me, you've learned something new there from listening to Sam and what he has to say about tax policy, how it could benefit us, and some of the stories he told to really bring tax policy to life. I know I learned a lot, and I found some of Sam's stories intriguing. The show notes for this episode are at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP86. And within the show notes, you can get links to my masterclasses for tax professionals, like in particular the Tax Research Masterclass. And you can also get links to articles that Sam mentioned throughout the episode and a few other articles as well. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes. And you can do this by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. And if you want to, you can sign up for email notifications for all episodes too. Episodes are bi-weekly and released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.